Hey UCC, here's your single take for Tuesday this week. Remember, these are one shot, zero edits. We take a part of Scripture and pull out meaning that applies to real daily life, all in under 5 minutes. And here's why we take that approach. I believe a few things about the Bible. I believe that this book, from Genesis through Revelation, is a snapshot of God. Like when you select that perfect photo every year of your family and you use it as a Christmas card. It doesn't capture everything about your family. It doesn't tell everything you did that year. But it is an accurate portrait of who you are now. And it's the image you want to show people. The Bible does not tell us everything about God. It does not describe God in the entirety of his power, his wisdom, his plans. But it is an accurate portrait of his character that he wants to show us. But God does not show himself to us in a vacuum. He reveals his nature, his character, his concerns and priorities, the very heart of who he is, through his relationship with people. Chapter 1 of Genesis opens up with God acting alone. But by the end of that same chapter, God has created people in God's likeness. And from there, into chapter 2, through Noah's flood, through Abraham and the patriarchs, through Moses and the law, through the promised land with Joshua, through the reign of David, through the prophets, through the life and death of Jesus, into the early church, everything we learn about God is via his relationship with us. So the Bible isn't only a snapshot of God. It's also a window into humanity, into why we are, where we're from, how we work. The Bible weaves together the stories of God and his people. In its pages, we not only find the heart of God, we also find ourselves. When we read it, we begin to see our story as part of God's story. But how, you ask, does that work in the reality we occupy right now? How do we find ourselves in God's story in the midst of this pandemic? Where are those times in Scripture where people had to do social distancing? We don't see stories of people quarantined and isolated, unless you reach back to the story of Noah on a boat with his wife and kids, closed off from the world, trying to escape a global crisis. When we meet Abraham, God has just called him to leave his country, his people, and everything he knew to follow God to a new, undisclosed land. And then Moses, who spent 40 years herding sheep in the desert, alone from sun up to sunset, daily, until God called him to free 3 million Hebrew slaves from Egypt. Fast forward to Jonah, who we find alone and afraid in the belly of a fish for 3 full days, who then came out with a very different perspective on life. When Elizabeth was preparing to give birth to a son who would be the greatest prophet since Elijah, a son named John, who would prepare the way for the coming Messiah, she went into seclusion for 5 months. Jesus, before he starts any ministry, before he calls any disciples, before he performs any miracles, he goes into full isolation for 40 days in the desert. Then he comes back in Luke chapter 4 with a clear understanding of himself and of his purpose. As you read through our scriptures, a constant emerges, not of the people of God avoiding isolation, but of God calling people to embrace isolation as a time to define themselves and to refine their view of God. God did not create people to be alone, for sure. We were created to be like God, to thrive in relationships and in community. In fact, the only thing about the creation story that God said was not good was when man was alone. But when we read how so many significant Bible characters found new meaning for themselves and new eyes for God during their period of isolation, we have to ask if maybe, just maybe, God is calling us to discover a deeper purpose or a higher vision or a clearer connection with Him in the very heart of our own social distance and self-quarantines. And that is what the next few single takes will be all about. We will dive into the isolation of Bible figures from Noah to Paul to Jesus himself, and find how our own stories of isolation during this pandemic weave into God's story. We'll see you all on Friday.